Jingawala, welcome to Tales of the Tweed. My name is Arabella and I'm here with you every morning, Wednesday, 10:30 a.m. to talk about Tales of the Tweed, and this month we're covering Mabo. We began talking through how land rights and native title exist in this country, beginning in the 1500s and then walking all the way through to present day. I did this and we started this series because on the 3rd of June is known as Mabo Day, so that's next week, and I would like the listeners to understand the concepts of native title and the concepts of why Mabo Day is significant and very important. We talked about the 1500s and about Pacific Island people and people in the Southern Hemisphere visiting London for the first time, negotiating land title and land rights. We talked about the Americas and how many treaties existed in the 1700s and the 1600s and the 1700s in the Americas as America was beginning to be settled and colonised. We talked about 1770 when Cook first mapped the coastline of Australia. We talked about 1788 when in fact people first came into Australia, into Sydney Harbour, and decided that they were going to remain here and take over lands here. There was a consciousness and an understanding and a behaviour that there was an expectation that treaties would be required, negotiations would begin, and it would operate in a very familiar and similar way in other parts of the world. That is, that discussions and negotiations would occur with First Nations people about land. There were many letters and correspondence between what was known then as the colony and then going back to London, talking about this effort and the need to negotiate, talking about hostile activities, talking about relationships with Aboriginal people, of course talking about diplomatic relations and the need for discussions and relationships to be built throughout parts of New South Wales. So it's really important to understand the psychological reality of what was occurring in the first 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years. There was certainly disease which started to actually decimate a lot of Aboriginal populations, particularly in Sydney and all through Parramatta, or the Darug people of the Eora Nation. But of course, there was this political or government pressure to also enter discussions and negotiations with Aboriginal people. They were seeking instructions back from London. At the same time, there was great pressure about the coast, about the Dutch coming up on the west coast and coming into Tasmania. There were other pressures that were going on as well. And so in those discussions, in that phase and in that time, when there was a rush to get more convicts over here, and you've got to remember that in the first few years, they weren't interested in building Australia. They were interested only in using it as a colony for convicts. They did not understand and did not appreciate the value of Australia too much later. So initially it was only going to be used as a colony for convicts. That shift in deciding to take over lands and deciding to then use it for farming and opium and sheep, which was the first kind of use of large portions of the colony, didn't happen until much later. As things progressed rapidly and people began to see the value of land, convicts who were often given land upon release. So if you're a convict, you were given land, you were able to work the land. You also had what was known as selectors, just people coming in and deciding that they were going to take land. That expansion happened rather rapidly over a very quick period of time. And in that expansion, when they became aware that there were different nations, different Aboriginal clans, which they had experienced in the Americas, it became a situation of the complexity of it all was too challenging. They decided, from a legal perspective, a legal doctrine perspective, that the idea that the land belonged to no one, there were no boundaries, even though they knew that to be untrue. They had established that were different clans all around the Sydney area. They understood different dialects. People were reporting back different relationships and certainly different clans and different families, distinguishing each other from each other, it meant that they were aware that there was multiple treaties that would need to operate in the same way they had sought to do that in parts of America. So you have the establishment of the government, recognizing that there are multiple nations, recognizing that there's a push on land and there's a desire for rapid expansion, and then of course appreciating that the complexity of that is too large a challenge. Even though Macquarie was asking for it, Governor Macquarie was asking for it, other government officials were asking for it, asking for directions from London, the decision was, well, we're going to pretend that there is no land ownership, there's not a delineated land ownership, there's no recognised land ownership, and that allows us to overcome the need for treaty on the international stage. And as we start to talk about it and discuss it in other parts of the world, it will be that there is no clear distinction and no clear land boundaries, which they absolutely knew to be inaccurate, untruthful, and a farce. So for the first 100 years, so 1788 to 1888, given that non-indigenous people first came into the Tweed region in the 1840s, and of course Queensland began to evolve and become its own colony and expanded from Moreton Bay in around the 1860s, 1870s, you can then understand how this underlying tension began to order the psyche, even though people were experiencing multiple clans and multiple nations in different areas of the country. There was a supported system of fake news, if you like, or this decision that Aboriginal people did not own lands, even though all of the evidence, all of the written evidence, all of the correspondence back to London since 1788 all suggested something completely different, suggested that Aboriginal people were here, they were distinct, they had particular boundaries, they were managing lands, they had large corroborees, large gatherings, there were systems, etc. That's why the tension around native title and around land rights is at times palpable. It's because for the first 100 years and potentially the first 150 years, there was a decision to uphold a falsehood, a narrative that was simply untrue. Now, next week, we are going to begin the history and complete the Mabo story by talking about what occurred from about the early 1900s. And we're actually going to move from 1900 to 1992, in which the Mabo decision was made and handed down from the High Court of Australia. I hope you join me next week for the final series of the month of Mabo. I've hoped you've enjoyed talking about how land rights and treaties operated in the colonies since the 1500s, and I look forward to speaking to you next week. Boogle Bear, my name is Arabella, here every Wednesday morning for Tales of the Tweed. Speak to you then.